Alright, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to review a video, something I normally don't really do, but I was like, yeah, why not? I watched this video and I was like, hey, it's kind of interesting to talk about, and normally I don't do this sort of stuff, but I was like, hey, why not? So we're gonna watch it together. We're gonna watch this video by Economics Explained, and we're gonna see what we can come up with. So, are you ready? Let's go.
On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would be terminating the convertibility of American dollars into gold, turning the world's reserve medium of exchange into something backed by nothing but belief. Over the next 5 years, the price of gold, which up until that point had been the baseline store of value, more than tripled in price. Thought of another way, by this same standard, the American dollar lost more than 2/3 of its value. This decision preceded 2 decades of record high inflation in the US, where prices are increasing by double-digit percentages year on year, all while the value of the American dollar slumped in international markets.
Yeah, so this is something that we have, of course, we know of, right? We know of the inflation in the 80s or in the 70s, I must say. Of course, it peaked in the late 70s, and then Paul Volcker raised interest rates to 20%, and that sort of ended it, that inflationary decade. And especially what we see today, I think this is a very relevant topic, and probably also why he made this video, because these days a lot of the inflation that we're seeing today is being compared actually to that period. So compared to the inflationary decade of the 70s, and a lot of comparisons are made. Are they the same? Are they different? So yeah, this is a very interesting topic. So yeah, I'm very interesting to see what else he has to say.
But what was less palatable was when this situation was reversed. High levels of borrowing to fund the Vietnam War, along with a number of other domestic issues, meant that the US economy was not particularly healthy towards the end of the 60s. Normally this would mean that the US dollar would fall in value, which, as long as that fall isn't too severe, wouldn't be a huge problem. As we saw earlier, it could actually help American exports, which could cushion the blow of the economic turmoil. But with pegged rates, this didn't happen. The other Bretton Woods countries saw that the American dollar was overvalued relative to what...
Yeah, so I'm going to stop the video right here, because something very interesting he talks about here. He talks about the Vietnam War and some other domestic issues, and I think what he means with that is a lot of spending, not only on the Vietnam War, but also, for example, on social welfare, and that entire program. And that had big implications, because at that time it wasn't really that good of an economic time. Even though that was sort of a recession, not that severe. It was a bit of a mild recession, and in that period, the president was Richard Nixon, and before that it was Lyndon Johnson. So actually Nixon followed Johnson up with that recession as well. And what I wanted to discuss here was that that was a big reason why we went off the gold standard, because we had run enormous budget deficits, and that increased a lot during that time, and at a very sort of expansionary fiscal policy. And that was, in my opinion, an important route why we went off the gold standard. And also what I'm going to show in a minute, when we look at the money supply, what happened after we went off the gold standard in 1971 with Nixon, we saw that the money supply increased a lot. And I will show that again in a minute. And I think the US was very restricted, and I think it's also what we see today. The US likes to spend. It has a habit to spend a lot of money, to go into a lot of debt with money it doesn't have. Also back in that time. And when we went off the gold standard, that sort of chain around the US to not spend how much as they wanted, that was finally released. So I think that's very important to note here.
They could trade their relatively overvalued American reserves for physical gold. Most participating countries, especially the French, started trading more and more of their American dollars in for gold, which caused 2 big issues. The first was that it reduced America's economic influence.
Now that, of course, what he's showing here is because of those deficits and because of all that spending, because of the war and the war on poverty and etc., that massively devalued the dollar. And what happened because of that, countries like France, or I think also the Netherlands, bought gold because it was relatively really attractive compared to dollars, because the dollar was so devalued. And that caused the gold reserves of the US to massively decrease, and that was a problem. But the true root of all of that was, of course, too much spending, right? It's again always a spending problem.
There are two basic types of gold standard. The first is what you probably think of when you think of a gold standard, and that's a system where there is enough gold sitting in a vault somewhere to redeem every single last dollar floating around an economy, even if everyone decides to redeem all of their money all at once. This is often called a full reserve standard or a specie standard, and these systems have existed throughout history, but only in very rudimentary economies. Most modern gold standards have been fractional reserve systems where, as the name would suggest, only a fraction of the gold necessary to honour all of the outstanding dollars are kept in vaults.
So what he's showing here is that the same what we're seeing today, right? We have a fractional reserve banking system, which means that commercial banks have deposits, but they don't hold all those deposits in cash in their banks. No, they only actually have to hold a certain amount, and for larger banks that's 10%, for smaller banks I think it's 3%, but 10% is most of the times what is used, and that is the reserve requirement. So imagine a very simple example. A bank has $1 trillion of deposits on its balance sheet. Now it only has to hold 10% of that, which is, let's see, $100 billion. Yeah, I can still do math. So that's the same what he's showing here with gold. Actually, central banks didn't have all that gold that was needed to back the amount of currency that was out there. So I think that's still a nice similarity with something that we're seeing today.
So the preemptive decision was taken to suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. This temporary suspension was later turned into an elimination of the gold standard entirely. So, was this a mistake? What?
And of course it was a temporary measure, but we know that there's nothing more permanent as a temporary measure by the government, right? That's a very famous quote.
Financial repression, not to be confused with economic depressions, are situations where savers earn interest below the rate of inflation. There are two ways to end up in this situation: high inflation or low interest. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Indeed, that does sound familiar. And it's not something unfamiliar, but as of recently it's sort of the habit, right? I mean, people got used to it. And actually, which is something which is quite funny actually, which was in where I live in the Netherlands, was very recent in the news. It was about student debt, and students were so used to a 0% interest rate on their student debt, which they have to pay back, that they actually thought that it could not happen that rates actually went up and they have to pay interest on their student debt in the future. So it's actually really funny that it has become such a habit of 0% interest rates and now actually high inflation that people just take it for granted that interest rates are actually zero. So I found it quite funny.
This is all great, but of course the biggest benefit of the gold standard is price stability. With a currency backed, even fractionally, by gold, it makes it much harder for reckless money printing to increase purchasing power enough to materially impact prices. Now, this is sort of true, but only...
And I think this was the main thought. I think this was the main reasoning behind why we had a gold standard. It had this disciplinary effect on the government and on the central bank to not print currency out of thin air whenever they wanted to. Because, hey, that's not possible if your currency is pegged to a certain amount of gold. Because if every dollar or if every euro needs to be backed by a certain amount of gold, you cannot print a lot of money, because that's just not possible, right? It needs to be backed by that amount of gold, and if there's no gold left anymore, you can't print any more money, or you can't create any more currency, and that had a major disciplinary effect on government spending. And what you're, for example, seeing today is that we have now the possibility to create currency out of thin air, how much, whatever amount we want to. And that wouldn't be possible back in those days when we were on the gold standard.
In a gold standard system, the central bank has its hands tied by how much gold it has. If the economy produces lots of gold and exports lots of stuff, it will have a bigger supply of gold-backed currency to play with, so it can reduce interest rates. If the economy's gold mines run dry and it imports more than it exports, then the central bank will be forced to raise interest rates and restrict the money supply. This can all happen completely independently of how the rest of the economy is doing. Gold reserves might be very valuable, but compared to all of the other industries in an economy combined, it's practically insignificant. This means that interest rates are not being set to stabilise prices. Instead, they are being set to manage the amount of gold the bank has. Matthew?
Now, I sort of agree on this point because I understand that it is a big disadvantage if your interest rate is dependent on the amount of gold in circulation, or if it is a good year for gold miners or not, or whatever. Now, that is the big disadvantage. But on the other hand, I'm not a big fan of the setting of interest rates because often, especially what we're seeing today, I strongly disagree with the interest rate that we have, and I think it is not the interest rate we are having right now is not a stabilizer for prices. I actually think it's very stimulative for prices, and I think inflation is going to go much higher because if you look at the real interest rates, they are way negative. They're way too negative. They should be much higher because for example, where I live in the Netherlands, we have close to 10% inflation. Well, the ECB key policy rate, so the interest rate that is set by the European Central Bank, is minus 0.5%. How is that possible? Why are they only thinking about raising interest rates in July of this year to with a quarter percentage points to minus 0.25%? Well, inflation is close to 10% here. That's just ridiculous. And same goes in the US. Although they've already started to raise interest rates, they're still way too low. Nudge them up a bit. Why not instantly go to, I don't know, 2 or 3%? That's much better. But hey, I mean, yeah, I disagree with with this. I disagree with central banks in general. So hey, maybe I'm a bit biased. So, but let's continue.
Correlation doesn't always equal causation, and almost every prominent economist agrees that leaving the gold standard was not to blame for the high inflation experienced in the 70s and the 80s. So,
Now that is an interesting statement he makes here, because when you think about it, no, on its own, leaving the gold standard it doesn't directly have an effect, but the consequence of leaving the gold standard, that had an effect, because in essence that meant we could create currency out of thin air. We weren't chained to this peg to gold, and I will show that in a minute. But when you look at the money supply, the money supply really was elevated a lot after that period when we went off the gold standard. So I think it wasn't particularly the fact that we went off the gold standard. No, I think it was the consequence. I think it was the reaction afterwards that had a big effect on inflation.
But if the money supply is not allowed to grow in line with economic growth, you are left with one of two outcomes. The first is deflation, which is bad for a number of reasons. Again, go and watch our video from last week to find out why. But another thing a restricted money supply can do is straight up restrict economic growth. If the money supply is restricted to what a central bank has sitting in a vault, then there may not be enough liquidity floating around to facilitate genuine expansion. We tend to think of the post-war period as the golden age of America.
Now, is he really talking about deflation and not enough liquidity in the system right now? Is like, come on. I mean, there's way too much liquidity in the system. I mean, even the chart that he showed, and I'm going to put up my own chart that I made a few minutes ago. Let's see where it is, over here. So now, what is this big spike over there? Is this some kind of error in the data? No, it's not an error in the data. Now, what I've showed you here is the M2 against real GDP. And actually what I also wanted to show, actually a few minutes ago, but I forgot to do that, is if you go to 1971. 1971 is when we went off the gold standard. Remember that. So what happened after 1971? Well, before this period, actually M2, so the M2 money supply, was quite stable over here. I'm sorry if it lags a bit here. But what happened after 1971? We shot up massively, and actually we stayed elevated. Yeah, I'm sorry that it lags like this, I'm sorry. But it stays elevated actually until, let's say, like 1990, and then it dipped a bit. But after this period, again, up until now, basically, M2 has been really elevated compared to real GDP. It has definitely been above it. And oh, by the way, I think I forgot to tell this, but this is a year-over-year percentage change. So it's not in absolute values, but it is a percentage change year-over-year. But getting back to this big spike here, this big spike here, yeah, that shows you that there is not a drain in liquidity in the system, in the economy, in the financial markets. No, there is too much liquidity because M2 exploded while GDP or real GDP absolutely crashed there. I mean, look at that divergence, look at that gap. That is enormous. I mean, that shouldn't happen in a free market, in a free economy, but it did, and yeah, it has major consequences, and that is what we're experiencing right now. Massive inflation. So, hey, blame the central bank. And by the way, if you want to know more reasons why central banks cause inflation, you can watch my previous video. I will put a link in the description.
People, perhaps understandably, like the idea that their money is backed by something, as opposed to our money today, which is backed by the belief that it has value. But what gives gold its value? Yes, okay, it has some very narrow industrial applications, and yes, it's pretty, but let's be real. Most of the value comes from people's belief it has value. Without that belief, it's just a soft, off-coloured, dense metal. Running an economy on a gold...
Now, you can probably guess I severely disagree with this statement. I think this is probably the boldest statement he made here. Because why does gold have value and, for example, fiat currencies, or I'm sorry, cryptocurrencies lovers, or why cryptocurrencies do not have value? Now, I will understand it like this. I will explain it like this. Gold has value because indeed it has industrial applications. You can use it in real life, you can look at it, it looks pretty, that gives you utility. You can use it in an industry, it has real functions in an industry, in a working economy. You can use it for dentistry, you can use it for aerospace, you can use it for medical care or medical equipment. There are a lot of applications for gold. But I think maybe something that is even more important is that gold has such a long track record for thousands and thousands of years of being a store of value and being a hedge against inflation. And I think that also gives us a lot of confidence in it, and why we should keep having confidence in it, and why it yields us utility. And I think, for example, with cryptocurrencies, which are only existent still since 2008 or something, and for example, a fiat currency, which only exists for around 50 years, yeah, I think that gives us a lot less confidence than something like gold. Alright, so that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to give a final concluding remark about this, because if I should give a quick summary of this and a conclusion of this, it looks like he's not really a big fan of well, maybe gold in general, but he's not a big fan of the gold standard, it looks like. That's something he showed in that last clip over here with the cyclist. But I think that in today's economy, it's probably not that beneficial to have a gold standard we used to have it. It's probably, it could be beneficial if we had a normal economy with normal amounts of debt and a normal amount of spending, etc., etc., then it could be beneficial. But at the moment in this economy, no, I don't think that it is even possible. Maybe in some sort of adjusted way, that maybe then we could have a gold standard. But yeah, let's be honest, with the Keynesians being in power at the central banks today, and the Democrats being in power in government, I don't see it happening. I don't see the gold standard happening. But yeah, I think that's a shame. I think it has a lot of disciplinary implications, which I think are very good. We should discipline the government and not spend a lot of money, and not print currency out of thin air, and not have all these spending programs and whatever. I think that's a good thing. So I think that's a shame. But I'm gonna cut it here because I'm probably talking way too much. I will probably see it at the end of this video. But yeah, that's it for today. Let me know what you think about the gold standard. Should we implement it or not? And yeah, that's it. Have a nice rest of your day, and I will see you around. Bye bye.